James had always imagined his new apartment would be a fresh start. After months of searching, he finally found the perfect place, a second-floor unit in a quiet building with a view of a park just down the street. It was affordable, close to work, and had everything he and his girlfriend needed for a comfortable life together. There was only one problem: the neighbor upstairs. At first, everything seemed fine. James and his girlfriend, Emma, settled in quickly, unpacking boxes and making the place feel like home. But soon, it became clear that their new apartment was not going to be the peaceful haven they had imagined. It started subtly. At first, just the occasional thud. Maybe it was the neighbor moving furniture around or doing something that caused the floor to creak. But the noise didn't stop. It got worse. Every night, without fail, James would be woken up by the loud, deliberate stomping from above. At first, he thought it was just a fluke. Maybe the neighbor was having a bad day or just didn't realize how loud he was being. But as the weeks went on, the stomping became a regular occurrence, sometimes every 15 to 30 minutes, sometimes for hours. The noise shook their bedroom, rattling the walls. It was impossible to sleep. Emma, who worked from home, started to struggle with her focus too. The constant noise made it impossible for her to concentrate. "Is he stomping again?" Emma asked one morning after James had woken up with dark circles under his eyes. James just nodded, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's been happening all night. I don't get it. Doesn't he hear how loud it is?" They tried everything. First, James went up to knock on the door and talk to the neighbor. A middle-aged man, probably in his early 60s, answered the door, and after a brief exchange, the man apologized. He promised to keep the noise down. James walked away, hopeful, but by the next night, the stomping was back, even worse than before. They tried calling the building's management, hoping they would do something. But that didn't help either. The management seemed to side with the older man, who had lived there for 5 years and brushed off James's complaints. "He's a long-time resident," they told him. "Maybe he just doesn't realize how loud he's being. We'll try to talk to him." But nothing changed. James and Emma were stuck. Their days and nights were being disrupted by the noise, and there seemed to be no way out of it. Worse still, they couldn't even find a way to prove the noise was real. The building's management didn't seem to care enough to help, and when James tried to capture the noise with recordings, the management wouldn't accept it as proof. They insisted on calling the off-site security team every time, but even when James did, they never showed up. It was becoming unbearable. The stress was starting to take a toll on their mental health. The constant lack of sleep was affecting James at work, and Emma was losing her productivity. They were both exhausted, drained by the relentless noise. And to make matters worse, James felt completely powerless. The management refused to do anything, and the upstairs neighbor clearly didn't care. Finally, after another sleepless night filled with the heavy stomping, James decided it was time to make a change. They were moving out. They had found a new apartment, one on the top floor where the noise couldn't reach them. But even though moving out was the right decision, something still lingered. The frustration. The feeling that they had been cheated out of their comfort, their peace of mind. And James? He was tired of being powerless. As they packed up their things, James couldn't help but think about one thing: revenge. This situation, this nightmare they'd endured for months, had cost them not only time and money, but also peace and sanity. He was done just being the victim. The neighbor had ruined their time there, and now James was determined to make him feel the consequences. James and Emma's frustration had reached its peak. The days of tolerating the incessant noise were finally catching up to them. Every night, the stomping grew louder, more purposeful, and every morning they woke up more exhausted than the day before. James had reached a breaking point. He hadn't been sleeping properly for weeks, and his patience was starting to thin. It was now more than just the noise. It was the feeling of being powerless. James had tried everything. polite complaints, multiple calls to management, even confronting the neighbor directly. Nothing had worked. The building management had shrugged off his concerns, constantly siding with the long-term resident. The neighbor upstairs, a heavy-set man in his 60s, had been there for 5 years, and his apparent status in the building seemed to make him untouchable. James had never been one to get easily riled up, but the constant disruption to his life was starting to affect his mental state. Emma's productivity had been at an all-time low, her work suffering due to the constant disturbances. She was always on edge, and it was clear to James that this wasn't just about the noise anymore. It was about their peace, which had been taken away from them without any consideration. After the third time, the management failed to show up when they were supposed to be documenting the noise. James couldn't take it anymore. The straw that broke the camel's back came when he called security at 2 a.m. after another night of relentless stomping. The dispatcher promised someone would be there shortly, but as expected, no one came. James was done waiting. By this point, the constant noise felt like a direct attack on his sanity. It was hard to focus, hard to relax. He couldn't even enjoy a meal at home without hearing the stomping echo through their walls. And what made it worse was that this was someone who didn't care at all about the impact his actions were having. James couldn't believe that his neighbor was living in this delusion that the noise didn't affect anyone else. "I can't take it anymore," James said to Emma one night as they sat in their dimly lit living room. She looked at him with concern in her eyes, clearly feeling just as trapped. "I know we're moving, but I need to do something. We shouldn't just let him walk all over us." Emma nodded, her voice tinged with frustration. "I know, James, but what can we do? The management won't help, and he's never home when we try to do anything." James thought for a moment. The management wouldn't help. The neighbor wouldn't care. They were leaving, yes, but leaving didn't feel like the closure he needed. It was as if he was letting this man win, letting this man continue living without consequence for his actions. That wasn't acceptable. James wasn't the type of person to let things go, especially when they had impacted his life in such a significant way. He had already come up with a plan. The move was already decided, but there was still time to make this man feel the weight of his actions. "I'm not just going to leave and let him think he got away with it. I have an idea," James said, a determined look crossing his face. James couldn't shake the thought of his neighbor upstairs, stomping around without a care in the world. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined to make this man feel something. There was no way he was going to walk away without leaving some mark on this situation. James knew that he had to strike a balance between getting the justice he felt he deserved and not making the situation even worse. That night, as he lay in bed, the all-too-familiar sound of stomping echoed through the ceiling above. It was loud, unmistakable, and relentless. Bang! Another thud. The floor shook. James squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the noise. The last few months had been nothing short of torture, and now that they were leaving, it felt like the final insult was being delivered. He wanted this neighbor to know what it felt like to be completely disregarded, but he wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to yell or confront the man again. That had already failed miserably. He needed to hit him where it hurt most, in his comfort zone. The next day, as James and Emma were packing their things, he began to hatch his plan. He needed to act quickly, before they left for good. The plan would require some subtlety and a little bit of humor to give it the sting it deserved. He would take advantage of the one thing his neighbor seemed to value most, his privacy. James knew the neighbor upstairs was always paranoid about being watched or caught. He'd overheard him complaining once in the hallway about how intrusive some of the building's security measures were. Perfect. The older man had lived there for years and clearly didn't want to be disturbed or embarrassed. If James could do something that would make him feel uncomfortable, That would be enough. It would be a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. After some quick thinking, James figured out the best way to approach the situation. He needed to create a disturbance, one that would make the man feel exposed and vulnerable, just as he had made James feel for months. And if things went well, it wouldn't take much time or effort at all. That evening, James decided it was time to put his plan into motion. It wasn't going to be anything too extreme, just something to send a message. He'd make it so that the neighbor would know he was being watched. James had spent the day meticulously preparing, his mind focused on one thing, making sure the upstairs neighbor would feel the discomfort he'd endured for months. The man above had made it clear that his presence and his noise was something James and Emma were supposed to accept. But James had reached his limit. The plan was simple, yet it had the potential to cause just enough of an impact to leave a lasting impression. It was nearly midnight when James put his plan into action. The stomping had started again, as predictable as the ticking of a clock. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of furniture being dragged, the noise that always came at the most inconvenient hours. James smirked as he heard it. Perfect timing. He waited a few minutes, allowing the noise to continue, giving it just enough time to truly settle into its usual pattern. When the thudding stopped, he moved quickly. James had a particular skill that could be useful in this situation. He was very good at being unnoticed. The older man in the apartment upstairs, for all his noise and stomping, was incredibly private. He rarely spoke to anyone, kept to himself, and never acknowledged the people in the building. He was predictable, and that was exactly what James needed. He quickly grabbed a few items he had prepared earlier, a roll of duct tape, a couple of plastic cups, and a large plastic bag. He wasn't planning on doing anything destructive or malicious, but he needed to create a little chaos that would make the neighbor think twice about his loud behavior. James set the bag just outside the man's apartment door. He arranged it in such a way that it would make a loud noise when the neighbor opened the door. An unexpected, jarring sound that would make him feel, even for a moment, as if someone had invaded his privacy. The plastic cups and duct tape were there to make sure the noise was loud and clear, something impossible to ignore. It wasn't about causing lasting harm. It was about sending a message. You're not as invisible as you think. He then did something a little more subtle. James took a couple of small pieces of paper and wrote something simple on each of them. I've been watching. You're not alone. He folded the notes up and slid them just under the door. He didn't need to explain any further. The words themselves would be enough. The neighbor was paranoid, and the thought that someone might have been watching him, or worse, that his actions were being documented, was bound to shake him up. James couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction as he finished his little project. It was the kind of small, clever retaliation that only someone who had been pushed to their limits would think of. He wasn't looking for anything big, just a subtle reminder that he wasn't the only one who had been inconvenienced, and he certainly wasn't the only one capable of causing discomfort. As he moved back to his apartment to finish packing, James couldn't shake the feeling of relief. It wasn't about revenge, he told himself. It was about feeling like he had taken back a little bit of control, something the neighbor had robbed him of for far too long. The next day, when they finished packing up the last of their things, James felt a sense of closure. They were leaving, yes, but in a way, this was his final act of rebellion, his way of making sure that man would know he had been exposed, that he wasn't the only one who had suffered. The days passed, and James tried his best to focus on the excitement of moving into their new place. The relief of being free from the constant noise and tension was palpable. Emma was already smiling more, her stress from the noise gone, and James felt the weight of his frustration lifting with every box they packed. But something about the way things ended with his upstairs neighbor stuck with him. As they loaded the last of their things into the car, James couldn't help but wonder what the neighbor had thought when he opened his door that morning. Had he been rattled? Had the note left under his door made him realize just how much he had disrupted their lives? James didn't expect a grand, dramatic outcome. He didn't think the man would come to his door, apologize, and promise to change. But in a small part of his mind, James couldn't help but hope that maybe, just maybe, the neighbor would think twice the next time he stomped around, dragging furniture in the dead of night. It had been a week since they moved into their new apartment, and the sounds of constant stomping and dragging were just distant memories. It was quiet now, peaceful. James had started to sleep better, something he hadn't realized how much he missed until he experienced it again. Emma was already back to her normal routine, working from home without any interruptions, and the atmosphere in their new apartment felt lighter, freer. Then, one afternoon, as James was unpacking the last few boxes in the living room, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. At first, he thought it might be some random marketing spam, but then he saw the name attached to the number. Neighbor from upstairs. James, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not some person you can just mess with. You think your little stunt was clever? It wasn't. You're going to regret this. James felt his heart drop into his stomach. It was the neighbor. The very person he had hoped would just fade into the background of his life. But now, it seemed like his actions had pushed the neighbor to respond. For a moment, he froze. The old familiar frustration began to build again, the anger at being disturbed, the sense of injustice at how things had been handled. But this time, it wasn't the same reaction. It wasn't pure anger. It was satisfaction, tinged with a sense of finality. James wasn't going to engage in a back and forth with this man. He wasn't going to let the situation get out of hand. It was over. He had moved on. James took a deep breath and typed a simple response. Noted. Have a good day. He sent the message and immediately felt a wave of relief. He realized in that moment that the only reason the neighbor was responding was because he had been rattled. James had done exactly what he intended to do. He had unsettled the man, made him feel exposed, and made him realize that there were consequences to his behavior. The neighbor had no power over James anymore, and that realization made all the difference. From that point on, James didn't give it another thought. The situation had been resolved in the only way it needed to be, by moving on. It wasn't about revenge or getting back at the neighbor in some grandiose way. It was about reclaiming the peace and control that had been taken from them. The weeks that followed their move into the new apartment were a breath of fresh air for both James and Emma. The constant noise, the sleepless nights, the frustration, it was all a thing of the past. The new apartment was everything they had hoped for: quiet, spacious, and filled with light. The peace they had longed for was finally theirs, and they settled into their new life with ease. But even as the stress of the move faded, something lingered in the back of James's mind. That final text from his upstairs neighbor. You're going to regret this. It gnawed at him in a way that James couldn't quite shake. It wasn't that he feared the neighbor would do anything. He didn't think the man had it in him, but more the fact that he was still haunted by the audacity of the threat. It wasn't just about the neighbor anymore. It was about standing up for himself, about not letting people push him around, and about reclaiming his peace. The sense of satisfaction James felt from moving on was profound, but the lingering anger that he hadn't had a chance to confront the situation in a way that felt complete made him uneasy. He had taken control of his life, yes, but he still felt like there was something unfinished, like the last bit of injustice still hadn't been addressed. James spent his first few days in the new apartment, adjusting to the quiet, but his thoughts continued to circle back to the upstairs neighbor. It was as if that final message had been left hanging in the air, unresolved. Emma, ever the calming presence, noticed it too. "You've been quiet lately," she said one evening as they were having dinner. "You've seemed a little off. What's going on?" James paused, putting his fork down. He knew exactly what she meant. For all the relief they had found in their new apartment, something was still bothering him. The past wasn't fully gone. "I don't know, Em," he admitted. "I guess I just feel like there's something left unsaid. I let the neighbor's behavior slide, but I don't think I really got closure. And that last text, it still sticks with me. It's like he's still trying to make me feel powerless." Emma put down her glass of wine and looked at him carefully. "James, you don't owe him anything. You've already won. We've moved on. We're out of that situation. That's the victory." James nodded. He knew she was right. But there was a deeper part of him that needed something more. He needed to let go of the last bit of control the neighbor still had over him, even if it meant simply acknowledging the situation one last time. "I get it, I do," he said. "But I feel like he doesn't even know the impact he had. He's just going to keep going on with his life, stomping around and causing trouble for the next person. It's not right." Emma sighed, but she understood. She had seen the toll it had taken on him. James had worked hard to move on, but the lack of closure was still eating at him. It wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing that the neighbor had gotten away with so much without consequence. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, James lay awake, turning things over in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his sense of justice wasn't about making the neighbor suffer. It was about ensuring that the neighbor knew he couldn't just get away with his behavior. And so James decided that, in his own quiet way, he would take back control. The next day, he set his plan into motion. It was small, subtle, but it would serve the purpose he needed. The neighbor, for all his rudeness, still lived there, still disrupted the peace of the building. James knew that if he could just make the neighbor aware of his behavior, if he could make him uncomfortable in his own space, it would be enough to get the closure he sought. It wasn't about sending a message of anger or confrontation. It was about doing something that would force the neighbor to think twice, to understand that his actions had consequences, even if it was in the smallest, quietest way possible. James knew that the neighbor had a long history with the management. The man was a long-term resident, and long-term residents often feel like they own the place, like they're untouchable. But James wasn't going to let that hold him back. He could still make his presence known in a way that would make the neighbors squirm, just a little. The day after James decided to put his final plan into action, he woke up feeling more focused than he had in weeks. There was something liberating about taking back control, even in a subtle way. His plan wasn't about big gestures or dramatic confrontations. It was about making his neighbor face the consequences of his behavior without directly engaging in a fight. James had learned that sometimes the best way to deal with difficult people was simply to make them uncomfortable in their own space, without lowering yourself to their level. James knew his upstairs neighbor had a few things he loved: his peace and quiet, his privacy, and his sense of control over the building. If James could disrupt even one of those things, it would be enough to make him realize that no one was immune to accountability. He had a simple, yet effective plan. Since the neighbor had always been home and in control of the situation, he would take advantage of this. James knew the neighbor didn't like any kind of intrusion, especially when it came to his privacy. And so, James decided to create the kind of disturbance that would be noticeable but not dangerous, just enough to shake things up. That afternoon, he went to the building's maintenance room. He had heard rumors about a small, harmless trick people use to mess with their neighbors without leaving any evidence behind. James wasn't interested in causing real harm, but he did want to remind his neighbor that his actions hadn't gone unnoticed. He found a few basic materials, nothing more than some harmless sound-producing items. and placed them just above the neighbor's door, near the ceiling. He set them in a way that, once triggered, they would make loud, jarring sounds. It wasn't going to be continuous stomping or furniture dragging. Instead, James was creating a brief, sharp interruption, something designed to make the neighbor feel like he was being watched or disturbed in his own private space. He finished his setup, satisfied with the small but effective mechanism. He didn't need it to be a grand act, just a reminder that James wasn't the only one who could feel the discomfort. Later that evening, as James sat in his new apartment, he waited. It was around midnight when he heard the telltale sound of his neighbor upstairs moving around. The stomping began again, but this time something was different. Bang! A loud noise echoed from the apartment above. Then again, and then another. The setup had worked perfectly. It wasn't the constant stomping they had grown used to. It was an intermittent, sharp noise, like someone had dropped something heavy. James smiled, leaning back in his chair. The neighbor would be confused. He would wonder what had just happened. It wasn't the type of noise James had been subjected to. It wasn't a relentless force. Instead, it was something that disrupted the man's precious peace just for a moment. But that moment was enough. It was the sound of payback. For the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of calm wash over him. The issue had been resolved, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a quiet statement of power. The neighbor wasn't able to continue his disruptive behavior with the same level of comfort anymore. James knew that, in his own way, he had taken back control. The next morning, James and Emma woke up to a quiet apartment, just the way it should have been all along. No noise, no interruptions, no drama. And as they sat together in the kitchen, enjoying their coffee and the peace they had longed for, James finally felt that the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. They were free. Free from the chaos. Free from the frustration. Free from the powerlessness that had weighed them down in that other apartment. As they packed the last of their boxes into the car, preparing to leave behind the building and everything associated with it, James looked at Emma, a sense of calm and closure settling in his chest. "We're done with all of that," James said, smiling. "We're free." Emma smiled back, relieved. "Yes, we are." James felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't because of any revenge. It was because he had taken control of his own life again. He had stood up for himself, for Emma, and for the peace they both deserved. The neighbor had no idea who he had just crossed, who he had underestimated. But James knew, and that was enough. As the last box was loaded into the car, James looked back at the apartment building one last time. It wasn't just about the noise, the frustration, or the anger anymore. It was about what they had gained by leaving. Freedom. And now, with the last of the past behind him, James was ready to embrace the future. Peacefully. I'll see you in the next story.